Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We're so glad to have you with us as we explore a critical topic in marine conservation. What is effective MPA management? My name is Annie Cross, and I am the Resilient Science Lead for the Nature Conservancy's Global Ocean. This webinar is brought to you by the Nature Conservancy's Reef Resilience Network in partnership with the Blue Nature Alliance and in collaboration with the International Coral Reef Initiative as part of their For Coral webinar series. So as the world ocean faces growing pressure from climate change and human use, the need for a well-managed MPA has never been more urgent. And while the number of MPAs around the world is steadily increasing, many are not yet achieving the level of protection necessary to make a real difference for marine conservation ecosystems and biodiversity. This is where the 30 by 30 commitment comes in, a global pledge to protect 30% of the world's land and marine areas by 2030 that are effectively managed, connected, and equitably governed. Today, we'll dive into what effective management truly means in the context of 30 by 30 and discuss how MPA managers can play a crucial role in helping countries meet these goals. We'll also take a closer look at the tools, guidelines, and best practices available to improve management outcomes at the site level. So we're very fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts who will share their knowledge and experience. Dr. Johnny Briggs, Director of the Pew Bertarelli Ocean Legacy Project, and Dr. Arthur Tuda, Executive Director of the Western Indian Ocean's Marine Science Association, or WIOMSA. I'll also be joining them at the end of the presentations to present some of the resources the Reef Resilience Network is developing on this topic. So we're looking forward to an insightful presentation, and we'll hope you leave with practical takeaways to help support the effective management of MPAs. The webinar will last for 1 hour, and the presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. The recording of this webinar will be available on the Reef Resilience Network website and YouTube channel. We'll also be emailing you a recording of this. So before we start, a few quick tips for navigating the Zoom toolbar. On the left, you'll see the audio setting button. You can click the up arrow and select for audio output options such as speakers, headphone, or other Bluetooth devices. And if you experience any technical difficulties, use the chat feature to send a private message to Paola Felix, who can assist you. Use the Q&A feature throughout the webinar to type any questions you have for the presenter. You can also choose to submit your question anonymously. And during the Q&A question after the presentations, you can use the raise hand feature if you like to be unmuted to ask your question. A quick overview of the agenda. So we're in the welcome and introductions. Next, Jenny will talk to us about the pathways to 30 by 30 and implementing Target 3 with effective management. Then it'll be Arthur presenting strengthening MPA management effectiveness. I'll wrap it up with a few tips on driving effective MPA management through assessments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, and there'll be a quick wrap up. So before we dive into MPA effectiveness, I'm going to briefly share about the network and our partner, Blue Nature Alliance. For 20 years, the Nature Conservancy Reef Resilience Network has helped marine managers and practitioners around the world effectively manage, protect, and restore critical marine habitats. 2025 marks the network 20th anniversary, which we're really excited about. And we want to thank and celebrate you, our network members, for sharing your time, expertise, and ideas. And of course, for all the hard work that you're doing day in and day out to care for our reefs, our world's coral reef. We have over 5,500 active members in our network and have trained more than 50,000 people over the last 20 years from more than 88% of the reef locations. To serve our global audience, we have a website called the Network Hub at reefresilience.org, which houses most of our resources. And nearly 1 million people visit our hub annually, It features the latest science and strategies for marine managers and include online courses. It includes toolkits on topic critical for reef resilience and effective management, some regularly updated case studies, summaries of new journal articles, interactive webinars, and our brand new podcast. And all of this content has been developed with over 400 global experts. This webinar is part of a collaboration between the Reef Resilience Network and the Blue Nature Alliance to support marine managers in their effort to effectively manage MPAs. The Blue Nature Alliance is a global initiative accelerating ocean conservation through partnerships with government, NGOs, and local communities. They collaborate with over 90 partners across 161 ocean conservation areas. The Alliance's project that they will impact over 2.2 billion hectares of ocean by protecting new areas and improve management of existing ones. The Alliance also fosters global condition to achieve the goal of protecting 30% of the world ocean by 2030, requiring enhanced human, technical, and institutional capacities. So enough about us. Let's hear from you. We have a quick poll for you to take to help us get a sense of the type of support you may need with navigating 30 by 30. Thanks, everybody. So it sounds like this topic comes up for most, 40% comes up frequently or occasionally. So hoping that this webinar will be very helpful. So I would like now to welcome Dr. Johnny Briggs. Johnny is the director of the Pew Bertarelli Ocean Legacy, and we're very grateful for him to take the time to come and give us a presentation over the 30 by 30 commitments. Thanks, Johnny.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak today, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'm going to offer a kind of big picture look, in the kind of policy and standards context of 30 by 30. And then Arthur's going to come in and kind of, delve down into the application of all this and it kind of on the ground, like, in real MPA projects in real terms. So we just go into the first slide, please. I'm going to start by offering the big picture context, basically. So we're going to start with the global biodiversity framework of the CBD, explicitly look at target 3 therein, and then delve deeper into the kind of progress against that targets and some of the thinking about effectiveness. And I think that approach is important because only by placing target 3 in the context of the GBF and considering what we believe the intent of 30 by 30 is, can we start to consider what an effective MPA or OECM might be, how it might function, and what the outcomes might be. So if we go on to the next slide, please. The GBF was agreed at the CBD COP15 meeting in December 2022 in Montreal. And some of you folks might have been there. And the overall mission of this ambitious framework is to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to recovery for the benefit of people and the planet. So quite broad, but to achieve that mission, there's 4 goals with 23 targets. And the 23 targets are shown here. And they're basically broken down into 3 categories. The first 9 are to reduce threats to biodiversity. Then we've got sustainable use, and then we've got the implementation and mainstreaming. Now, if you Google this, like you Google, what are the global biodiversity framework targets for 2030? It's basically 30 by 30 that generally comes up. Maybe it's regionally, but when I just did this, AI told me all about 30 by 30. And, perhaps that's due to the kind of slogan. It hits the sweet spot of the algorithm. Maybe it's, the fact it's quantitative, or that, it's been prioritized by big international NGOs, such as the ones that I work for. or, you know, certain governments, or maybe it's the perceived overarching impacts towards, you know, achieving real benefits to the ocean, but it's the one that comes in. But then if you go into the next slide, please, that, you know, the language therein, you know, this is target 3, OECMs, MPAs, effective conservation measures. You know, you want to see effectiveness coming out of this. But what we've found is actually the meaning of this, like what you want to deliver through 30 by 30 is quite kind of subjective. You know, you could look at it, you know, do you want this target to deliver, you know, do you want it to replenish biodiversity? So do you want it to kind of take the ocean back in 30%, you know, of waters to some sort of pre-industrial level? Or do you just want it to halt degradation? You know, is the outcome that you want to sort of maintain where we are today, freeze today's footprint? So the question when you're looking at this that you have to ask yourself is, I think, you know, if we achieve 30 by 30, what do we want the ocean to look like? What impact should we have? You know, on whom or what? So if you go to the next slide, please. You know, I think when, you know, working in conservation, the kind of commonalities that we see when we look at what we want 30 by 30 to deliver, and that we want, if possible, we want these areas to enhance biodiversity. We want to make the planet more resilient to climate change while empowering indigenous peoples and local communities to play a fundamental role in that process, you know, and benefit from the outcomes. That's what I think target 3 should deliver. And it's interesting what we're seeing play out a lot, and here's a couple of other targets, 5 and 10, is there's a slight blurring of the lines, for example, around sustainable use. If you sustainably manage, you know, fish stock, for example, I would argue that area-based measure should generally fall within targets 5 or 10, for example, rather than target 3. So that's what we think the sort of meaning of target 3 might be. And if we just look at the next 2 slides, I kind of just play that out in, you know, images. You can see this one here, but maybe the next one is quite useful. This wasn't published, but it kind of shows that target 3, you know, at the top right here, MPAs and OECM should be what's really delivering that increase in biomass, whereas it's sustainable fisheries management and the other 70%, which is helping to basically not undermine those gains that you're getting from 30 by 30. So if we go into the next section, I'm just going to look at progress and strategies. So a lot of this is taken from a report which came out around the recent CBD COP. And this is from a report which was led by Bloomberg and the Campaign for Nature. And it's called, if you look it up, On Track or Off Course, Assessing Progress Towards the 30 by 30 target for the ocean. And if you check out this screen grab here on the left, this is from Protected Planet, which is, you know, the database which feeds into the CBD. And 8.45% is where we're at today. So all the MPAs and OECMs combined gets to 8.45%. And if you look at the map to the right here, you can see about 99% of that is actually MPAs rather than OECMs. And you can also see that most of them are offshore. So they tend to be in areas where you don't have much conflicts from other industrial activities. So you're not really in these rich coastal areas. And just to quickly touch on OECMs, we're kind of going to look at MPAs mostly today because they've dominated the landscape, but OECMs are increasingly being considered. And just really simply, if your MPA, the intent of an MPA should be to protect biodiversity. So you're basically restricting certain activities in those waters to ensure that biodiversity flourishes. OECMs benefit biodiversity, but it's by a kind of tangential reason. It's this kind of secondary benefit of what you're doing. So for example, if you have a war grave in the ocean, you might not want to have any activities around that to respect the dead. But as an impact of that, biodiversity might flourish. So then you might count that area towards 30 by 30. And we're sort of seeing these thinking mainstreamed into fisheries and other things. That's going to play quite a prominent role. So if we just look at the next slide, if we continue on the trajectory that we're going at the moment, we're going to hit about 10% by 2030. There's been about, I think, 0.5% added in the 2 years since the 30 by 30 goal was agreed. And the next slide also shows you that, up to now, according to that, the next slide is going to show you proportionally waters of different regions, how much they've contributed towards 30 by 30 or how close they are to 30 by 30, which shows you a kind of geographical bit of variation. Also, I think the point at the bottom, areas beyond national jurisdiction. We only have, the Ross Sea MPA and another one within CAMLAR, and actually the NACES MPA in the Northeast Atlantic. So there's not many basically. So that, that's perceived as the kind of new frontier as the hopefully the ratification of the High Seas Treaty comes in over the coming years. That extra 70% of the ocean can be protected to increase that proportion. So just on the next one, what you can see here is there's actually 14 countries, according to this report, through their own waters and their overseas territories that have achieved 30 by 30. But it's the kind of column just within likely effective protection, the second column, which is interesting because it shows that according to this analysis, a lot of this area is not actually effectively protected. So what does this analysis mean, or what do we generally mean by effective conservation? If you go on to the next slide, we're just going to quickly look at that. So generally, something called the MPA guide is used quite a lot to measure effectiveness of protected areas. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that. And that's a kind of multi-institutional effort led by Oregon State University. And that helps to understand the extent to which an MPA is likely to deliver the outcomes that we discussed before. And what it does is it measures two things. It's level of protection, which it looks at as the degree to which damaging activities are restricted. And it also looks at the stage of establishment. That's the kind of efficacy and maturity by which that MPA is managed. So, there's also, it looks at kind of what you should expect, enabling conditions which will drive effective conservation. So that might be, core elements such as local leadership, capacity, good governance, sustainable financing, effective monitoring and enforcement. But when you apply that guide, that tool to this 8.45% of the ocean, it shows that only 1/3 of the area designated within MPAs these days provides a level of protection likely to yield meaningful conservation benefits. It shows that 1/4 of the area within MPAs is not yet implemented, meaning they're not really legally enshrined in law within the waters. 1/3 allows industrial or highly impactful activities, so like large-scale commercial activity. And the vast majority of the kind of large, fully protected areas, which are deemed effective, are actually kind of offshored in overseas territories. So we're kind of neglecting the busy industrialized regions and choosing to focus on the remote places where there's less conflict, basically, with commercial activity. And there's other means of looking at efficacy as well. If you just look at the next slide, here's an IUCN tool, which kind of takes a more holistic approach, which I encourage you to take a look at. But I'm not necessarily going to get into that today. But that's my kind of sweeping, quick global overview of where we are and just thinking a little bit about effectiveness. But that's from the kind of, I guess, the policy sphere behind a computer screen. So I'm going to, I think, it's Arthur who's going to jump in next, who's going to actually say, well, how does that apply on the ground and what's he seeing? All right, thank you.
Thanks so much, Johnny, for that great presentation. And I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Arthur Tuda. Thanks, Arthur.
All right, thanks, Johnny. Thanks, Nick. Let me put on my camera. Great. Yeah, so thanks a lot. And I'm going to pick up from where Johnny has left and try to bring this in regional context of the Western Indian Ocean, where marine conservation work has been going on for the last 60 years. And so this question of effectiveness is quite an interesting one, because what has been achieved in the last 60 years and what remains to be done and what's working and what's not working. I think those are questions that we should all be ready to think about. But next slide. Right. I would like to begin from this image that I think we've all probably encountered in our readings from the Living Planet report that really presented the situation of plants and animals globally and portrayed a not very encouraging or promising picture that we've lost nearly 73% of monitored wildlife populations globally in the last 50 years. And if things continue in the same way, then we might end up losing nature, and the future generations may not have anything to support their living in this planet. And so part of this is the reason why we are now discussing 30 by 30 and what needs to be done. And everybody agrees that we cannot continue in the same trend of losing biodiversity. And so something had to be done. And so the global biodiversity framework comes in to really provide a framework on how we can bend the curve, so to speak. And this requires bold conservation and restoration efforts, as we've all known. And more importantly, management effectiveness needs to be stepped up. So it's not about just setting up areas for conservation, but ensuring that the objectives and purposes of these areas are actually achieved. Next, please. Yeah, so the 30 by 30, and I want to thank my team from the YO. This presentation actually comes from a collection of many presentations that we've done jointly as WYOMSA and from the Western Indian Ocean Marine Protected Area Networks and some colleagues who've been working on different topics. But this particular slide really provokes us and reminds us that 30 by 30 is not just about creating more space. It's a really loaded target that we need to think about a little bit more. And because it tells us what we should do, that is protect 30%, but also it reminds us where we should do this, areas where we have important biodiversity, and how we should go about this, like make sure that everything is equitably governed, effectively managed, looking at ecological representativity and well-connected systems, but also ensuring that rights of indigenous people are taken into account, the seascape approaches are looked into, and sustainability becomes the underlying goal. So it's not just a 30 by 30 in terms of creating more space. And I think it's one of the targets that has drawn a lot of attention, but what comes to mind is the space, the increase. But we are forgetting that the bigger chunk of the target is really where we should do this increase, how we should do it, and what we should ensure that we have in place to be able to achieve this. So I think this broadens really the definition of management effectiveness to ensure that all this is encapsulated in management effectiveness. And if you go to the next slide, I want to now introduce how this plays out in the Western Indian Ocean region. And the previous speaker has already mentioned that we are seeing an increase of protected areas or marine protected areas globally. But in the Western Indian Ocean region, that is the same story. So since 1959, we see this exponential rise in area coverage of marine protected areas. And this is based on data that was from a study that was led by Nairobi Convention and WYOMSA in 2020 to basically check the status of Aichi Target 11 by 2020. And where we were at that point was that we had 143 MPAs, and the numbers were increasing, as you can see from the chart. So that's a good part of the things, and these numbers are bound to increase as we move forward because of the commitments that countries have made to the global biodiversity framework. But if you look at the next slide, you will see that in as much as the areas are continuing to grow, we're still a long way in achieving target 3. So if you look at the graph, where we are is the blue rectangle below there, and where we need to be by 2030, or what we need to add in terms of area coverage, is the green square. So really, if you think about it, in 5 years or less than 5 years, we are supposed to triple the area under marine conservation in the Western Indian Ocean as we talk now. Now, that's a really optimistic goal. And the question is then, how do we achieve that, but at the same time ensuring that those new areas that are created actually work, that they're actually effective? So in the study that I've mentioned that was conducted in 2019-2020, the next slide shows us that we still have huge problems with managing our marine protected areas. So we conducted a survey of 143 MPAs in the region. And from that graph, you can clearly see that, many of them still have really operational and management challenges that impede effective management, from legislation to weak administrative support, to operations, to staffing. So really, just about 40% of MPAs and LMMAs that were assessed in the Wire region at least showed some what you'd call effective management. Of course, measuring this from the tools that we have, like the MET and the IMETs. But more interestingly, if we go to the next slide, you'll notice that it's not all the same for all MPAs. Bigger MPAs tended to show less effective management. And I must issue caution that this is not necessarily the case in all situations, but I think what we found out was that the bigger the MPAs in this region, the less resourced they are. So they have fewer staff, fewer management operational aspects, and all these things that go with setting up new marine conservation areas. So one of the things we must think about as we try to achieve goal 30 by 30 is how much do we invest in effectively managing these areas? So the bigger they are, the more resources they require. And in areas or contexts like the West Indian Ocean region, where resources and personnel are a limiting factor, what approach should we take going forward? So these are the hard questions that we need to talk about, even as we talk about management effectiveness and target 3. Next slide, please. So how can 30 by 30 be meaningfully achieved in our region? One of the things we've noticed from a lot of our studies and interactions with countries in this region is that the country contexts really matter. And this must be something that is well thought about as we design programs and as we scale up marine conservation, that we need to be aware of the different contextual needs and the different capacity needs of each country. And we all need to focus on bending the curve that I showed you as a bigger goal for the region. So we need to set up a regional or vision that guides countries on how they should proceed, even though we are all different. But more importantly is ensuring that everybody understands what you're talking about. So 30 by 30 should not be a discussion that is restricted to a few organizations and people who understand what it really means. We need to make sure that everybody is part and parcel of these targets, and they understand actually what we need to be doing together. Next slide. Yeah, so a few examples of achievements that I can point out in the region, of course. The first one is, of course, very strong partnerships with local communities. And as I talk about context again, this is the context of Madagascar, where we've seen success in using locally managed areas, locally managed marine areas to scale up marine conservation. So while MPAs have been the dominant factor in this region, we are increasingly seeing locally managed marine areas coming up to support this target 3. However, the problem we have is that very few of them have legal recognition. So these are contextual issues that need to be addressed very urgently, and to begin to place LMMAs as part and parcel of the contribution to the GBF targets, because they're playing a very key role in supporting communities, but also linking conservation and livelihoods in a way that really responds to the needs of the local context. Next slide. Other initiatives that really we've initiated to support effective management is to support capacity building. So just a recent study that we did with members of the Western Indian Ocean Marine Protected Area Network, we see that for every 365 square kilometers, there's only one staff managing that size of space. So when I talk about capacity, really, we must think of investing in capacity and matching that with the expansion of areas under marine conservation. So really, the expansion should not move faster than the capacity that is required to manage those areas. So you can imagine this ratio of 1 to 365 square kilometers in the WIO, practically you don't expect that any effective management would happen if that is the staffing level that we have in the region. So as WIOMSA and other partners, we've been paying a lot of attention to professionalizing marine conservation in the region, assessing and certifying practitioners, putting more emphasis on the people who actually manage these areas. So I think that's where a big part of the investment also needs to go into as we aim for 30 by 30, but let's also match this with an equal capacity to manage those areas. So in the region, that is our key focus at the moment. Next. So another important element that we've incorporated in improving management effectiveness is to strengthen the network of MPA practitioners through the Western Indian Ocean Marine Protected Area Network, which brings together over 400 MPA and LMMA practitioners. And this network has supported different ways of capacity building through exchange and learning. And we find that it is one of the ways that we can drive this whole desire to have all these areas managed in an effective way by bringing all the countries together, all the people work in these areas in a form of network where there's exchange, learning, and sharing of experiences. Next slide. Yeah, so through different partnerships, we've been able to design programs that actually support management of sites. So we've launched new programs like one that we call Ifadi Blue, that is going to give grants to sites that have experienced challenges of management. And this is a grant program we're starting just this year with support from Minderu Foundation and other partners working closely with the Western Indian Ocean Marine Protected Area Network to be able to directly support site management. So basically supporting effectiveness assessments, but not just that, but putting in resources to actually manage these areas to be able to achieve the objectives for which they were designed. And more importantly, building strong partnerships. And I want to thank all those partners and organizations who have supported MPA work in the region. And that's going to be my last slide. I think target 3 requires that we form strong partnerships. Okay, just go to the next slide. We form strong partnerships across different institutions and across different organizations. So all these partners have been contributing to supporting marine conservation work in the region, supporting the network of marine protected area practitioners, and ensuring that the region actually works collectively as one big whole area of effectively managed marine conserved areas. So thank you very much. And that's my short brief from the Western Indian Ocean region. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Arthur, for this great presentation. So I'm going to be wrapping up this webinar with a few examples of resources that we're putting together based on this topic. Both presenters today emphasize that achieving the 30 by 30 conservation goals requires not only the creation of marine protected area, but also their effective management. And you heard both presenters describe some elements of effective management, such as enabling conditions that need to be in place to support implementing actions in the management plan. For example, including the design of MPA. And these actions needs to be monitored to provide information on where there may be challenges, which should feed into a feedback loop, which is essentially adaptive management. And then through this iterative process, MPAs will finally meet the desired outcomes. So next slide. Being able to understand whether an MPA is reaching its conservation goal isn't good enough to be able to understand where the challenges are and how to improve this effect and its effectiveness, because it's looking at an end goal, and really what you want to see is how things are getting to it. So assessing MPA management effectiveness through assessments is one of the ways to identify where marine protected area and managers are meeting challenges and prioritizing effective actions. There's a lot of different MPA management effectiveness assessment tools available to managers, and so you might get a little bit lost. Arthur presented the Global Monitoring and Evaluation Tracking Tool, which is the MET. and the Integrated Management Effectiveness Tool, which is the IMET, that is used, worldwide. Indonesia, for example, on the other hand, has developed a national tool to assess all of its protected areas. NOAA, US government agency, also has developed its own assessment, the NOAA MPA management assessment. So how do you choose? Well, fortunately, most of these assessments have many similarities. And so you probably will end up in the same place no matter what assessment you choose. So for example, most of them assess elements in each of the management cycle. So for example, they will ask if the enabling conditions are in place to support the implementation of the MPA and its regulation. It will prompt to see if the planning is sound and will leads to the desired outcome. And it will require you to provide data on the success of the implementation of its management plan. So let's do a quick poll and see where in the management cycle do you feel you may need the most support to promote effectiveness? So is it in the share improving communication and stakeholder engagement? Is it in the assess strengthening baseline assessment and context understanding? Is it in the plan creating clear and actionable management plan? Is it in the implement executing plans and strategies effectively? Analyze, measuring progress, or adapt, adjusting your strategies to the data you're collecting? How are we doing, Paola? Wow, so it looks like most of you, 34% of you, is in the implementation, executing plans and strategies effectively, but very divided around all other steps of your management cycle. That's quite interesting. I would have thought many would have said analyze, measure, oh, sorry, adapt, but we don't have adapt. So. Oh, we do have adapt. I thought most would have adapt. Okay. So next slide. Thank you. So the other commonalities between all of these assessments is that in addition to looking into each phase of the management cycle, most assessments consider 4 key areas of MPA management. So they look at governance. Is your governance equitable and functional with the interest of rights holder and stakeholders, which should be fairly represented and addressed? Is the design clear, sound? Does it clearly define objective based on conservation values and stakeholders' interest? Is it adequate? Does the management system include sufficient personnel and financial capacity, for example, which Arthur talked about? And does it achieve its objective? Does the MPA achieve what it's meant to do? So most of the assessment look into all 4 of these topics. Next. So while it's important to have assessment that feel relevant to your MPA, and so I think that's why some places create their own, there's really 2 critical ingredients to their success. First is, instead of thinking just of the assessment, it's actually the act of doing the assessment, collecting the data, sitting down with colleagues and having structured discussion around critical elements. That is one of the most useful part of the assessment. And 2 is being able to use that assessment to understand where the challenges are, and then to create a strategy to address those, which is essentially adaptive management. Next. So RRN is developing an online course on MPA effective management, which goes through all the elements of an MPA management plans that are required to achieve effective management and prepare managers to go through an assessment like the MET. This is a free course to take. It's going to launch in the summer of 2025, and there'll be a mentored version where you'll be able to interact with experts shortly after. We also have a podcast where we talk about management effectiveness and 30 by 30 on our hub, on our website. And we have a case study that's also coming on the topic of MPA effective management. So when we email you the recording of this webinar, we'll share the links to both of the podcasts and the case study of the resources. And if you're one of our network members, you'll receive an invitation to the mentored course, and you'll be announced. Also, in light of 30 by 30, there's a flurry of work trying to support the two most important capacity factors to MPA successes, staffing and budget. And so in the coming month, the network will be sharing a Blue Nature Alliance survey about MPA workforce and budget to inform the development of global guidance. So please keep an eye out for that as well, because your participation is critical to make sure that the products that we're developing is as tailored to your needs. And that wraps it up for our webinar. So we are now opening it to you, the listeners, with our question and answers. So I invite both Johnny and Arthur to turn on their video. And Deanna is going to facilitate the questions. Oops, sorry.
Great. Thanks, Anik. And thanks, Anik, Arthur, and Johnny for your great presentations. We've had a lot of questions come in through the Q&A, so we're going to try to get through as many of those as we can, and we might be kind of synthesizing across some of those questions. And so I think one of the first themes that I was seeing is that there are a few folks asking about both considering criteria for MPAs in terms of what are the requirements for an MPA to become part of the 30 by 30 quota for a country, and then also thinking about when you're thinking about the effectiveness of the MPAs, how you can go about thinking about what indicators are particularly useful to consider for that MPA. So I was wondering, maybe Johnny, you could speak to that first, and then Arthur could add anything in.
Yeah, I will start. I mean, the reality of it, a country's progress towards 30 by 30 is that, you know, an MPA or an OECM is whatever they deem it to be, right? If a country submits something to the World Database of Protected Areas, it is considered as state verified, it's in there. So that's why you have this kind of patchwork of MPAs, which either are excellent or some of them, you know, less effective. But ultimately, I think, you know, again, there are different ways of looking at this, but the IUCN, for example, categorizes MPAs into 6 categories, which kind of go from fully protected, like 0 human impacts whatsoever, down to kind of sustainable use, but while preserving biodiversity. I also think that, again, the MPA guide is a really useful metric here, because it actually looks at specific activities which could be taking place in the area that you might consider an MPA. And if you basically have something going on like mining or huge infrastructure projects, or, you know, industrialized fishing using really highly impactful gears, it's immediately considered that that should not count as an MPA because it would not yield conservation benefits. So again, I can stick it in the chat, but I would go to the MPA guide as a really good indicator of what you should really, you know, what criteria you should follow for something that you are considering as an MPA. Over to you, Arthur.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an important question about the metrics that or indicators that we need to apply, and I think part of the challenge we have, as I said, it goes back again to what the context, what countries and organizations managing MPAs really feel that account for effectiveness, because we have all these globally agreed matrices, but in some cases, when you talk about effectiveness, say, for example, in terms of enhancing fisheries or fish biomass, and on one hand, the objective of that side was about livelihoods. So, you know, there's all this, when you now go to the reality of measuring effectiveness on the ground, there are all these different priorities for people who manage these sites. In our context, livelihood benefits to adjacent communities tops the list of what they consider to be effective. So if you, of course, ecological governance and also socioeconomic indicators are important, but you might want to start looking at what resonates well with the local context. So on one hand, if I say, oh, tourism has improved and revenues have improved, but the local communities feel like, you know, the MPA is not fair on our livelihoods, then again, it begs the question of what is really effective at the end of the day. So I guess I would the MPA guide is a good start really to look at the national you know, the national state of how things are. But when you go deep down to the operational level where the rubber meets the road, stakeholders and local people have a different understanding of what is effectiveness. I think this also is where we need to begin to think about what the scientific community thinks of as effectiveness and what does the local context perceive as effectiveness. So a balance of both would be really the way to go.
Arthur, talking about livelihoods, a question came up in the chat about livelihoods for you, about thinking about how you can incentivize local fishing communities into participating in the management of MPAs when, you know, livelihoods are their constant worry. They're thinking about being able to feed their families both today and tomorrow. And so thinking about any insights you have on that or offering alternative work opportunities and how those could be funded. So wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's $1 million question, because every time if you work in a context like ours and you talk about MPA, the first thing that comes to people's mind is where we're going to get our food. And the way MPAs have been set up probably historically have created part of this problem of, you know, locking people out kind of thinking, but not necessarily true in most cases. But we have to think about actually factoring in some of these important considerations in the expansion of MPAs. I think previously expansion was driven a lot by ecological concerns, which is still okay. But I think for a long time we ignored governance and socioeconomic concerns of expansions. So I think the way to go is to ensure that all this is integrated into MPA scaling at the beginning, not at the end. And resources are also allocated to integrating local context issues into MPA planning. I mean, on financing, I think that whole package needs to be considered together. So you talk about, and I talked about inclusivity, and I talked about, you know, not leaving anybody behind, making people understand what you're talking about, what is 30 by 30, what does it mean to the local person. So I guess even the way we go about MPA design and planning must be rethought if we are to achieve 30 by 30. And all that needs to be thought of as one whole instead of running with the expansion and leaving everything else behind and imagining that we're going to deal with the livelihood issues after, you know, and not now. So I think it's just basically an integrated approach to 30 by 30.
Great. Thanks, Arthur. Johnny, you had put some references related to OECMs in the chat, so thanks for that. And as Anik said, those will be shared. But there are some questions that have came in about OECMs, particularly too related to sustainable fishing. One of the questions that came in was noting that OECMs often are sustainable fishing practices and just better regulations for certain areas and don't necessarily have clear conservation objectives, but are focusing more on that sustainable fishing aspect. And so the question was wondering how we motivate for OECMs to be considered for Target 3 when we are still mostly talking about sustainable fishing practices.
Thank you. I was looking at all the questions. I'm glad you asked me about OECMs because there's a lot of hard ones that I didn't want to be given. Yeah, I think, you know, OECMs, so they first appeared in, I think, Aichi Target 11, like, you know, 15 years ago. And it was only in 2018 that the CBD, and I put this in the chat, it's called a COP decision 14.8, where they actually came together and defined, well, what do we mean by OECMs? And what are the specific criteria that should be met if a site is to qualify? And these criteria are kind of, you know, it's got to be governed and managed properly. So there's got to be a proper governance authority. It's got to achieve long-term in situ conservation of biodiversity. So it's got to conserve biodiversity, and it's got to, bring also associated ecosystem functions and services and respect spiritual, cultural, and locally relevant values. So you've got these criteria that need to be met. But then I think because 30 by 30 has become such a prominent part of the discussion, and again, due to NGOs such as mine who've placed it there, countries are really thinking of all the targets. They're like, okay, how do I reach 30 by 30? So there's this deep evaluation of, well, do we have OECMs that could help us get there? And you've got to apply it on a case by case basis. But again, there's some subjectivity of what might count and what might not count. And again, I showed that slide of target 3 versus 5 and 10, because that kind of gray area between sustainable management, which should count in 5 and 10, or some sort of fisheries management, for example, that might count as an OECM and going to target 3, is kind of it's been up for debate, for and LMMAs are getting looked at. There's some great examples of sites, but in a kind of fisheries context, I think, to give a couple of examples, if you manage a fishery to MSY and maybe sort of have measures to protect, to guard against specific bycatch of key species, should that count as target 3, or is that sustainable management? There's a lot of discussions going on with large areas where, RFMOs, for example, regional fisheries management organizations, are saying, okay, we won't trawl the seafloor, so therefore, because of that decision, biodiversity will benefit, but we are going to industrially fish the pelagic realm with, purse seines, for example, or longlines. So should that be an OECM? And, again, it comes back to that question I asked at the beginning. How do you think the ocean should look as a consequence of 30 by 30, as to whether you believe certain of these, measures should count or shouldn't count, to be honest with you? And it is kind of still a bit debated, but ultimately it's in the eye of the beholder. It's in a case-by-case basis for, management authorities to undertake that evaluation and work out where they sit on that. I'm sure that was as clear as mud, but that's that for now.
Thanks, Johnny. Anik, there have been a few questions that have come up about thinking about the management of MPAs in the management cycle, things like balancing competing interests, kind of thinking about how you're assessing where you are in the management cycle. And I think a lot of these questions relate to kind of thinking about practical steps that managers can take to foster collaboration among partners and really be thinking about addressing all of these different competing needs and pulling in everybody who needs to be during that management cycle. So could you speak to some practical steps that managers can take to address some of these issues?
Yeah, thanks, Diana. In the management cycle, there's at the beginning, or the first step, enabling and planning, there's definitely a moment where you're thinking about integrated management. So where are your threats coming from? Are they purely within your MPA, or are they external to your MPA? And then where are the sources? Who are the key stakeholders around these threats? And who are the key agencies that traditionally deal with these threats? So for example, if you've got terrestrial runoff from agriculture, upland from your MPA, that would be one area where you start thinking about, how can I best collaborate with these agencies or work with these agencies? And so part of a MPA assessment also has a assessment for the social context, understanding who benefits from what, who is impacted by what, and that sort of dictates or that sort of support you into thinking about how to navigate all the stakeholders, deal with conflict if there are conflict between users or people who may benefit from these MPAs. And so this is actually work that your management team is supposed to take at the very beginning and think about. And so there's, for example, in the course, there's lots of resources of where you can go to try to start understanding that and doing integrated management, which we call it integrated management. to be able to address some of these challenges.
Great. Thanks, Anik. So another question that came up in the Q&A is a participant was wondering how effective can debt for nature swaps be in helping countries achieve their 30 by 30 goals and holding them legally accountable for designating MPAs and funding their management assessment, and then wondering if there's a way to ensure that conservation impact is measured just than process-based metrics. So wondering if any of the speakers can kind of speak to this, to thinking about some of these different tools like debt for nature swaps in relation to 30 by 30 goals.
So maybe if I can attempt to go first. So I think debt for nature swap, these are innovative conservation financing mechanisms that are coming up, and they're supposed to address the huge financing gap that we are seeing in marine conservation, which is part of the big problem that is causing not well managed MPAs. Because as you can see clearly, the biggest issue we have still in many MPAs are the inputs. As I said, you establish an MPA, but the resources, the staffing, all those things that go with managing that site are rarely considered in the planning. So the planning just focuses on the space, but nobody thinks about how is this going to be managed the next 10, 20 years. So planning must take into account long term. So if you set an MPA and establish a few resources at the beginning and not think of how to sustain that in the years to come, I think that's where the planning goes wrong. That's why I said conservation planning must not just look at the ecological aspects, which are important, but look at the longevity of this site in terms of management. How do we incorporate that into MPA planning? If there's no hope of managing this site in the future, and it's going to be a paper park, then we might as well not think of that idea. So net debt, okay, it's a tongue twister, but that mechanism is supposed to come in and support, but it goes on with other factors that are also important for MPAs to be effective. And the point that we must focus on the impact and not on the processes, I agree, but there's no impact without process. Okay, if you focus on the end, you want fish biomass to increase, and you're not investing on patrols, you're not investing on demarcating boundaries, you're not investing in management planning, then you cannot go and start measuring impact. You only measure the impact once you put in place invested. It's like a farm. You have to plow, you have to put your fertilizers, and then now expect results. But you cannot set up an MPA and wait for the impact. So there's a lot of investment that needs to be made for this site to remain intact, or to restore this site, or to improve management of this site. So I agree that measuring impact, ecological value is important, but the processes are equally important, because then there'll be no impact to measure at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Arthur. That's a really great summation of that. Johnny, anything to add there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I've been with in my job for 10 years now, and I've certainly noticed that when engaging with local governments or partners, the first thing that comes up now about an MPA project is, let's talk about long-term sustainable financing. That wasn't the case before, but that's the first thing now. We need to talk about this and establish how revenues will come in perpetuity to support the capacity building, the management. If we protect an area so we're no longer issuing fishing licenses, how's that revenue going to be substituted? So these conversations are at the forefront. And just to use one example that we worked on was the debt for nature swap with Ecuador for Galapagos, which went through quite recently. And this was kind of, in effect, you buy up debts for a country like Ecuador at cheaper rates, so the interest goes down, so they owe less, and as part of that deal, money becomes available for the management of ecosystems, and in this case, it was the Galapagos Island MPA, and in effect, then you have a local board in this instance called the Galapagos Life Fund with various stakeholders who then decide. There's a whole process to decide which projects should therefore get this funding to help kind of monitor the protections, to help build capacity, to undertake science, etc. So that's a kind of case study on how it's working, and that's just started to dispense funds. So yeah, that's an example. Cheers. Exactly. Whoever put that in the chat, that's exactly what it is.
Great. Thank you, Johnny. And so I think that is all the time we have for the questions, but I think talking about sustainable financing is a good toss back to Anik to mention all of the different resources that are available on the network.
Thanks for everyone for your questions and discussion. There was no way we were going to get to all of them. So thanks so much. So the best way to stay updated with resources that we may have mentioned here and new resources that can help with management effectiveness is to become a member with a Reef Resilience Network. Next slide. And to do that, you go to reefresiliencenetwork.org and you select become a member. So it's quite easy. Please feel free to email us with any question about today's webinar or about the network, and you have the address there. And be sure to check us out on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube for recording of this for YouTube. You'll be prompted to take a short survey when the webinar closes. So please share your feedback on the webinar because as you know, your input is valuable and it helps us improve. So Jenny and Arthur, thanks so much for presenting. It was a great discussion as well. And thanks everybody for joining us and listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers, bye.